Hi, my name is Lou Dangzal and I'm an immigration lawyer in Toronto, Canada. Today we have a very special guest. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Fiona.
Hi, I'm Fiona Seiger. I am a researcher at Erasmus University in Rotterdam, that's in the Netherlands. And yeah, I've known Jansen for a number of years now. We go back to even before our time together at the National University of Singapore. We
That's
met
right.
before.
We
Yeah.
met and it was under very serious circumstances. We were introduced by a very good friend of ours, Jojo Abinales, who teaches at the University of Hawaii in Honolulu. And we met in the Philippines, in Quezon City, where Fiona was staying before she started her doctorate in Singapore. Isn't that right?
Yes, yes, there was a coffee shop and it was all very formal.
It was all very formal in a Los Angeles headquartered coffee shop for sure. I kind of miss that coffee shop. We don't have that in Canada. Do you have that in Europe?
I'm not in that specific one. Which one was it again? Was
The
it the
coffee
one with
bean
the
and tea leaf.
that one? Okay, I wasn't really sure which one it was. No, we don't. We
Huh.
don't.
Makes
No.
sense.
No.
It's Europe. You have all sorts of, great cafes, especially in
That's
Vienna,
true.
where you currently are.
Yes, that's true. We do have a Starbucks, and we might have maybe another coffee shop brand here. I'm not really sure, but they're obviously not very, present, I would say. Yeah, Starbucks thought back then, many years ago, thought they would conquer the market, and they ended up closing down a lot of the outlets they actually opened up. So sorry, I'm laughing. I'm not, I don't.
That's okay. I mean, Vienna can boast all their amazing cafes. What was the one that you took me to when I visited you in Vienna?
Café Central.
Can you
Yes.
tell us a bit about Café Central?
Café Central is in the first district. It's not too far from the Hofburg, which is like the seat of the government. Most government offices are in the first district, and it's actually quite a nice cafe to go to because they have a wonderful ceiling. So it's in an old building, and yeah, on weekends they also have piano music if you enjoy that. And well, a lot of Viennese cakes and coffee, of course. I think back then when we went, it was still easy to get in. You just walked in and had coffee. But
That's
by
right.
now it has become so popular that at least before Corona, the pandemic, when it was like tourism season, there would be queues in front of the
That's right.
cafes.
Yeah, I heard
Yeah.
about that. I got lucky being able to visit such a storied place because if I understand, that's where a lot of intellectuals back in the day would hang out, right?
At cafes in general, so this one, yes, but then there's also other cafes in Vienna that are known for, intellectuals hanging out and discussing. Havelka is another one that's very
Mm,
different from Café Central. Café Central is like very beautiful and high ceilings and decorations and very golden. And Café
right.
Havelka is really like more
One day,
darker.
right. One day when, travel is a thing again, I encourage you to visit Vienna for all the wonderful cafes and just the history of this beautiful city. But I promise you guys, we're talking about coffee here for a reason because there is this other coffee brand called UCC, which is oddly enough a Japanese chain from Japan, from Tokyo. UCC markets itself as Viennese coffee, and I think it's an interesting pivot to my next question. Fiona, what's your previous research project? I understand that you spent some time in Japan too, right?
Yes, yes, I have. Before I returned to Europe, I spent how many years in the Asian region? So half a year I worked in the Philippines. I was 5.5 years in Singapore, and then a total of 3 years on and off in Japan. And that's because I studied Japanese Filipino children, so the migration of children born to Filipino women and Japanese men from the Philippines to Japan. And of course, also citizenship claims on the part of Japanese Filipino children towards Japanese nationality or citizenship. In Japan, it overlaps. Yeah, NGO activism on their behalf as well. So that was my main study research topic. Yeah.
I mean, in case you're wondering, because this podcast is normally about Canadian migration stories, the reason why I figured that Fiona would be a nice interviewee for today's podcast is because Fiona, basically peddles in the market of lived realities of migrants. She's very much well versed in qualitative research and case studies. She's been doing this for several years, and I think her work on migration stories and immigration and migration infrastructures is actually pretty important. And I think this is a pretty recent pivot since your return to Europe,
Return.
Fiona. Can you talk to us about migration infrastructures and identities? As you basically pivoted back from Asia to Europe.
Mm-hmm. So, do you want me to speak more about my previous research on Japanese Filipino children and then kind of speak about both like the identity questions, but
Sure.
also migration infrastructure, and then, yeah?
Yeah, you can just use that as a way to sort of like smooth it over. And the transition stories itself, it's also very fascinating. And to us, for immigration practitioners here in Canada, at least, I can say that when we do our intake, when we deal with our clients, it's also very important to us to understand, to know our clients better. And I think the sociological lens offers a lot to our colleagues at the bar.
Okay, so I think I will keep the identity part a little bit shorter because I think what's important is what followed from, or yeah, what followed from the like the meaning making and the identity constructions of Japanese Filipino children, also with the help of activist NGOs that made claims on their behalf. So I looked into how children born, mostly so in the Philippines, to Filipino women and Japanese men who had very little contact with Japanese culture at large, if you like, their Japanese fathers, their Japanese families, so their blood relatives in Japan, who had very little or no lived experience in Japan, how these children then still, and also often their mothers and people supporting them, sort of created this identity of being half Japanese. And yeah, how being half Japanese became something that meant something or became very important, right? So, and I found that this had to be understood also within the context of the migration histories between the two countries, and also what it meant to be Japanese in the context of the Philippines, because it could also, having a Japanese parent or a claim to Japanese ethnicity could also be a form of privilege in a way. Yes, because, well, as in many countries, you have, racialized or ethnic hierarchies, and there are certain privileges that come with skin color or name or a claim to a certain heritage or descent. So that's not only North America, it's actually all around the world. And then in the context of the Philippines, with its post-colonial history, you also have certain hierarchies lingering on. So the Philippines has not only been a Spanish colony and an American colony, it has also been a Japanese colony for a short period in time. And there is also a certain notion of, well, there is a term used in the Philippines commonly called mestizo. It translates to mixedness, for instance. You correct me if I'm wrong, but that's how I usually translate mestizo-ness or mestizo. And it usually refers to people who have like European heritage of some sort, right?
I mean, you see that anchor across Southeast Asia too, right? In the
Yes.
Malay-speaking regions of Baranicans. Also in the Americas. I mean, in Canada, the closest interface that I found was the Métis, which
Mm.
I think it derives it from the French term métissage,
Mm-hmm.
if I'm
Mm-hmm.
not mistaken, which is very, very much close to the Spanish term mestizo, as
Mm-hmm.
you just mentioned. So it's very, very on point when you mentioned that racial hierarchies, ethnic groupings, and privilege essentially exist not just in specific corners of the world, but practically everywhere.
Yes. Yes. And sometimes we're not aware of that because we're so concentrating on actually being quite ethnocentric in criticizing, certain ethnic and racial hierarchies in particular places, and rightly so. Yet it is always interesting to also look, across the globe and take on a more comparative perspective as well. There's
So
actually so there, if you're interested, or if the viewers are interested in looking into more anthropological, sociological work, there's a special issue coming out in, or maybe it has come out already, but it's, soon, in the journal Ethnic and Racial Studies on inter-Asian racisms.
hmm,
And the
interesting.
editors, the editors are Sylvia Ang, Brenda Yeo, I think Elaine Ho. I hope I didn't forget someone, but these three are
Oh,
surely
it's
the editors.
Brenda's a part of it.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
for our viewers in Canada, Brenda Yo, those who are not familiar, Brenda Yo used to be, at least when I was at NUS, used to be the head of the geography department, and she's pretty much a mainstay in migration studies across the world, really.
Yes. So if you're interested, read that. And to
Mm.
get back to, what I started
Yes.
just before, I just wanted to finish it off by saying that if you have a claim to Japanese heritage in the Philippines as well, this can also entail certain privileges, whether it's people treating you a little bit different, or people assuming you come from a wealthy background, or having access to a wider world via citizenship, because people would then maybe think that you have, both Filipino and Japanese passports.
Right.
So there is also this idea of, privilege through mobility, because not
Mm.
everyone is mobile. So you can
Hmm.
cross borders, you can look for education and jobs abroad, where, with a Philippine passport, you would have a harder time because you need a visa for almost everywhere except ASEAN. But still, anywhere else, you would have to queue at embassies and make a good case for yourself in order to be let into other places. But with a Japanese passport, that is much easier. And in Japan, you, of course, as a national and citizen, you would have the right to work anyhow.
It's a form of a migration social infrastructure in a sense, because if it enables
Yeah.
certain mobilities and if it enables you access to certain things in society, that's really interesting. Thanks for sharing, Fiona. Now, can we flip the coin a little bit? How do these Filipino Japanese children, face reality when they end up in Japan? Just very briefly, just give us a taste.
Yeah, so it's oftentimes it's not as expected. So there are much more positive expectations. Probably it also depends a bit on their age, right? So
Mm,
some come as children, some in their youth, some get their passports or their recognition in the around age 19, 20. They have to get it ready by
mm,
2021, because that's the age by which you have decided what nationality you take on.
right.
And yeah, a lot of people say life is hard in Japan. They have to work a lot. It is hard to afford certain things. And it's more fun in the Philippines, which is also the tourism tagline. Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing that. Actually, that two things that really struck me. First is age, and second, adaptation issues and how they intersect. It's common. It's a common theme in migration studies in Canada. I think pretty much cuts across any place where there's a lot of in migration. I would say, and it's fascinating how that like works with the identitarian politics that's based on the racial hierarchies, the ethnic hierarchies that are created, the attendant issues that are brought about by identity, as you mentioned. But I'd like to pivot a little bit, Fiona, to how we sort of like loop it back into Canada or North America. I just wanted to make this like, comparative approach essentially. And the whole reason why we're very lucky to have Fiona is we get to have a comparative lens today, because so far in this podcast, we've talked about, Canada for the most part, a little bit of Hong Kong at some point, but I also want to bring in some European perspectives. At some point, Fiona, we were talking about, the various refugee crises, the waves of refugee crises in Europe. You talked about specifically Cyprus, for example, and how that intersects with international education. And I think offhand, I've mentioned to you that international education has become one of the main access points to gain immigration status in Canada. So can you tell us about how education is now being marketed in Europe?
Mhm. Yeah, so international education as a way into a country is nothing new, right? And very often you go to university and then you get your education there, and eventually you might also have visas that are especially for graduates, so they can look for jobs, and it's kind of sort of talent training oriented. Now, in what I've found out about Cyprus. So I've been conducting remote field work, I have to say, over the past year in collaboration with a local partner we have there, with asylum seekers in Cyprus. And what I've learned, which I found very surprising to anyone working in Cyprus, this is not news. Just to say, this is just for me very surprising, is that a lot of people seem to come through colleges that are either located in the Republic itself, in the south of Cyprus, or in the north of Cyprus. So for people who do not know, Cyprus is an island with Turkish part north or Turkish occupied part north, depending on which side you're on in this political conundrum, and a Greek southern part or majority Greek southern part, which is the Republic of Cyprus, which is part of the European Union. And between the two, there is no border. There is a buffer zone, which is also referred to as the Green Line. So it's not actually a border, yet it is kind of a border. It's not an official border, yet it delimits two areas, and you're not supposed to cross from the north to the south without, going through checks. Just, as you would go through checks when you enter the Republic of Cyprus at the airport, let's say, checking whether you have the right to enter. So what happens is you have a lot of colleges. I said in the south, there are some as well, but I've mostly heard about those in the north who recruit a lot of international students and also advertise their universities all around the world, especially in Africa. They are very strong there. And apparently there are also a number of agents advertising or sort of being in touch or recruiting potential university or college students in Pakistan and India. But what often happens is that people then come in on their student visa, but after a semester or so move from the north to the south, or whenever the student visa runs out, or they run out of money. That's also possible. I'm not saying that none of the students who actually intended to go for studies at these colleges, I'm not saying that none of them actually did intend to study there, but often expectations and realities do not match. And then when people run out of money but want to sort of not go home but remain on the island, the only possibility they see is to cross the Green Line, go to the Republic of Cyprus and apply for asylum.
That's very interesting how education agents essentially have found a niche market here. But I remember from our conversations off camera, you had mentioned something along the lines of marketing Northern Cyprus as the European Union.
Yeah, so I got, after these conversations, I got quite curious about, agents. So I just tried to look for them, and, they mostly advertise their services on Facebook. Sometimes they're addresses. Most of the time, they're just phone numbers or email addresses. And then in some cases, it is not entirely clear, or it is not made clear that there are two parts to Cyprus, and that the university is not on the European part of Cyprus. And then it's written study in Cyprus, study in Europe, or European university, but there is no mentioning that the site where the university is on, the northern part, is not actually part of the European Union, which is different. So there is a bit of, I would say, like information not being communicated quite clearly. I would think purposely so.
Right.
Yeah, to give the impression that people who go to these universities would then be studying within the European Union and have all the rights that are tied to a status in the European Union.
Given the, we know that certain countries have been going through like various waves of crises, but the more recent one, which is the current pandemic we're living in, really has punctuated and made certain problems around the world acute. Have you seen a rise in, a proliferation of, I suppose, let's call them advertising strategies on the part of, let's say, not so well-willed or well-intentioned agents, essentially, to lure people into Northern Cyprus and marketing it as, Europe, instead of not being clear about it not being a part of the European Union?
So no, because I looked up these agents just to confirm what I had been told during interviews and to sort of look into it myself. I just got curious. So I just looked around and to get a bit of an impression of what's happening on Facebook, but also on YouTube. You have a lot of YouTubers discussing studying in Cyprus. Most of the time, what I see is just people, giving tips on, what kind of jobs you could get if you're there, but also showing like the good life.
Fascinating. I mean, that's an interesting pivot to my next discussion point with you. And we've talked about this before, and I think every time we talk about it, you get really excited. So I'm excited now to talk about it with you. Digital and immigration infrastructure and its shift to the digital world. You talked about Facebook's modes of conveyance of information. So too with YouTube. What are your thoughts on, these forms of immigration or migration infrastructure that enable I suppose, the sharing of information and how to do this, how to do that when it comes to immigrating anywhere really, whether it be North America or Europe or around Asia.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people draw their information from their mobile phones, right? And these are navigating tools. There are tools to know more about the place where you're headed. There are tools about knowing about your modes of transportation, which may be other people. I've also heard through some interviews with people who work with a lot of asylum seekers that WhatsApp groups, for instance, WhatsApp or Viber groups are very widely used by agents or brokers, or you could call them traffickers or smugglers, depending what exactly they offer, and prospective migrants in forums like these closed groups, Viber and WhatsApp groups, where information is exchanged, promises are made, deals are made, and if someone comes back to say, "Hey, you tricked me," they're just being thrown out of the WhatsApp group or out of the Viber group. So that happens.
So it's not as open as, say, for example, if you're on Facebook, it's more publicly accessible, unless it's a closed group too, right?
Yes, I'm sure that there are lots of closed groups on Facebook as well. I would think that if someone has an interest in, attracting customers, I'll say, because it's a business, attracting customers, you would have like a visible page, but then you would take the details probably elsewhere, I suppose, like via phone or via emails. You first say, "Hey."
DM
So
me for the details.
yeah, very often that's the case. So there is just a very superficial sort of information displayed on public pages, and then everything else has to be done.
So would you call that the hook, and then they have to like fall for it and essentially get roped into a more intimate conversation about the details?
Well, yes, but that's also typical sales, isn't it? I mean,
Right.
that's just.
I mean, you said it at the beginning, it's a business. And I think it's
Yeah.
very important to highlight that, because a lot of people think that, those who fall for it, like, think that, these are normally like networks where people help each other, encourage this chain migration. But, at the end of the day, it's a business, isn't it?
It is a business for the agents, yes. And that's also what some of the people who made use of these services told me. It's a business and they're concerned with you until you're somewhere there. And if you're in trouble once you're at your destinations, it's no longer their problem because they
Right.
fulfilled their part. So it's not a charitable organization
Right.
trying to. No, it's a business. And some people do get what they paid for and what they wanted, and other people do actually
Get in trouble, I guess.
get in trouble and get how do you say arnaqué in English?
Scammed. Sorry
Scammed.
for
Thank
the.
you.
Yeah, sorry. So Fiona is one of those gifted ones. She speaks English, French, German. I was gonna say Austrian, but I'm just kidding. And Japanese, and she speaks a little bit of Tagalog too, actually.
Continua lang.
But yeah, no, Aranake is the specific term that you're looking for, and in English it's scammed. And you're right.
Yeah.
A lot of people really fall for these sales pitches. You're right. And
Yes.
for some people it actually works, and for some it doesn't. And it's a
Mm.
very familiar story for us here in Canada who are in the world of immigration, really, because there's more and more, groups, self-help groups especially, or let's say non-experts pretending to have some expertise and providing advice on Facebook, for example, or on YouTube about their own personal experiences on how they did it. But at the end of the day, no immigration story is the same, even if the laws, and no matter how similar the facts are, unfortunately. And, there's so many variables that you can't control. And I suppose this has always been a point of pain for a lot of people who essentially don't get away with it when they, for example, in my practice, when I do some consultations, some people would say, "Oh, that's because that's what my friend did and I thought it would work for me." And I'm like, no, not necessarily, because at the time when your friend came to Canada, the rules were very much different at the time when you came to Canada. So
Mm-hmm.
it might not necessarily be the same for you. It's a tricky world, the world of migration writ large, and not just Canadian immigration. And I think you'll agree with me on this, Fiona, is that the world of migration is constantly shifting. It's almost like quicksand. It's very tricky and perilous if you don't know what you're doing, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I also heard from people in Cyprus that the rules and regulations seem to change
Mm,
quite frequently, and it's hard to keep up and to keep for first-line practitioners, for instance, to inform firstly people who are part of their group who work with migrants, but also their beneficiaries or members themselves, like the migrants they work with, to inform them about the changes. That's just what I was told. I cannot
mm,
point out specific changes
fair.
in the regulations, but they usually pertain to what kind of work asylum seekers are allowed to take up, to what kind of categories are open to them, which ones are closed, kind of
Right.
the time people have to make appeals, and
Mm.
whether there are differences made depending on whether they're from a safe country of origin or a country of origin deemed not safe,
We would need
all
to
these
get a
kind of things.
Cypriot immigration lawyer, a refugee lawyer,
Yeah.
to actually speak to that for sure. And I do get it. Like the European Union's southern border has always been a live issue, and things are constantly shifting when it comes to policies. It depends on how
Mm,
the bloc comes to an arrangement and how it would deal with its immigrants, its refugees, its asylum
mm-hmm,
seekers. It's a very, very contentious area, I would say, of international law. And it's interesting to draw parallels as to what the North American experience is, whether it be in the U.S. southern border or even with America's border with Canada. Really, the Canadian southern border. There's also points of contention when it comes to refugees. So all of this is a fascinating world, and I think we can all benefit from a very comparative lens. Which brings me to my final point for today's podcast. Actually, I would like to take the opportunity to thank Fiona for coming to our show and to promote the Migration Podcast. So, Fiona, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the Migration Podcast.
So the Migration Podcast has existed since last year.
Mm,
And what we do is we feature migration researchers who speak about their research in a much more concise way than I have done today. And yeah, it's an audio podcast. We're not on YouTube. You can find us on SoundCloud. We also synced up with a number of other podcast apps. So just look for us. And we also have a web page dedicated to the podcast on the IMISCO website.
mm,
What is IMISCO, you ask? Well, IMISCO is the largest academic network of migration scholars, academic scholars, of migration scholars in Europe. So it's written IMISCOE, and
right.
the website is imisco.org. So we are also there. Yeah, our goal was to, have people speak about their research and give sort of an easy but broad overview of migration research, what people look at, what they have found, etc. And we have a number of guests who have actually spoken about the relationship between migration and digital mobility, meaning the digital media, social media, the smartphone, if you like. There is a very interesting link there. And yeah, just listen to the episodes.
For sure. I mean, even from immigration law, I can tell you that it's, an element that has basically accelerated things for better or for worse. The diffusion of information has always been, turning points in the history of humanity. We can think of the Gutenberg press, for example, when things started to get standardized, when books started to become a thing, when newspapers became serialized. Information dissemination has always become critical junctures for humanity's history. And I think we're living through one of those interesting transitions, and immigration cannot escape this reality of humanity, I think. And on that note, well, Fiona, thank you so much for joining us today. And I really hope that our listeners will get a chance to, head over to the Migration Podcast and to check out the wonderful, wonderful research that IMISCO is doing. Links are going to be included on the description of this video. And if you're listening to us on audio format, it will be included in the description as well. And this is ImmLight. Thank you so much. Bye.